Hi everyone, this is my reading for Act 4, Scene 3. And this is the summary if you'd like to copy it down in your books on page 156. Macduff arrives in England and tries to convince Malcolm to fight with him. Malcolm is suspicious at first, but then pledges to do all he can to restore peace to Scotland. Ross arrives and reports the slaughter of Macduff's family. This picture will represent Malcolm, son of Duncan. This image will represent Macduff, Thane of Fife. This image will represent the Doctor, and this image will represent Ross, Thane of Ross. A little bit of the history of the setting of this scene. So it's well known that throughout Macbeth there are many compliments to King James. When King James came to England, he took Shakespeare and his troupe under his patronage, and they were renamed the King's Men. We can see some of these compliments throughout the extensive biblical imagery, as well as the references to the supernatural and witchcraft. This scene, set in England, focuses on the 11th century king Edward the Confessor. Edward the Confessor was the king until the middle of the 11th century. And when he died, his death triggered a huge battle known as the Battle of Hastings, where different people vied for his throne, which was eventually won by William the Conqueror. Now, Edward the Confessor claimed to have an incredible gift of being able to heal through his touch and to get rid of evil through his touch, which was a gift that Christ had in the Bible. And we may know by now that King James was very much interested in Christian scripture, and he wrote he commissioned the King James Bible in 1611. And both King James and his predecessor and aunt, Queen Elizabeth, well, I don't think she was his aunt, his mother's cousin, Queen Elizabeth, had claimed to have inherited this gift from Edward the Confessor. Let us seek out some desolate shade, and there weep our sad bosoms empty.
Let us rather hold fast the mortal sword, and, like good men, bestride our downfall and birthdom. Each new morn new widows howl, new orphans cry, new sorrows strike heaven on the face, that it resounds as if it felt with Scotland, and yelled out like a syllable of dolour.
What I believe I'll wail, what no believe, and what I can redress, as I shall find the time to friend, I will what you have spoke. It may be so perchance. This tyrant, whose sole name blisters our tongues, was once thought honest. You have loved him well. He hath not touched you yet. I am young, but something you may deserve of him through me and wisdom, to offer up a weak, poor, innocent lamb, to appease an angry God.
I am not treacherous.
But Macbeth is. A good and virtuous nature may recoil in an imperial charge, but I shall crave your pardon. That which you are, my thoughts cannot transpose. Angels are bright still, though the brightness fell. Though all things foul would wear the brows of grace, yet grace much still looks so.
I have lost my hopes.
Perchance even there where I did find my doubts, why in that rawness left your wife and child, whose precious motives, those strong knots of love, without leave-taking, I pray you, let not my jealousies be your dishonours, but mine own safeties. You may be right, just, whatever I shall think.
Bleed, bleed, poor country, great tyranny, lay thou thy bases sure, for goodness dare not check thee. Wear thou thy wrongs, the title is afeard. Fare thee well, Lord, I would not be the villain that thou thinkest, for the whole space that's in the tyrant's grasp, and the rich east to boot. Be not offended, I speak not as an absolute fear of you. I think our country sinks beneath the yoke, it weeps, it bleeds, and each new day a gash is added to her wounds. I think withal there would be the hands uplifted in my right, and here from gracious England I have an offer of goodly thousands. But, for all this, when I shall tread upon the tyrant's head, or wear it on my own sword, yet my poor country shall have more vices than it had before, more suffer, and more sundry ways than ever, by him that shall succeed. What should he be?
It is myself, I mean, in whom I know all the particulars of vice so grafted that, when they shall be opened, black Macbeth will seem as pure as snow, and the poor state esteem him as a lamb, being compared with my confineless harms.
Not in the legions of horrid hell can come a devil more damned in evils to top Macbeth.
I grant him bloody, luxurious, avaricious, false, deceitful, sudden, malicious, smacking of every sin that has a name. But there's no bottom, none, in my voluptuousness. Your wives, your daughters, your matrons, and your maids could not fill up the cistern of my lust and my desire. All continent impediments would o'erbear that did oppose my will. Better Macbeth than such a one to reign.
Boundless intemperance in nature is a tyranny. It hath been the untimely emptying of the happy throne, and fall of many kings. But fear not yet to take upon you what is yours. You may convey your pleasures in a spacious plenty, and yet seem cold. The time you may so hoodwink, we have willing dames enough. There cannot be that vulture in you to devour so many, and will to your greatness dedicate themselves, finding it so inclined.
With this, there grows in my most ill-composed affection such a staunchless avarice, that, were I king, I should cut off the nobles for their lands, desire his jewels in his other's house, and my more having would be as a sauce to make me hunger more. That I should forge quarrels unjust against the good and loyal, destroying them for wealth.
This avarice sticks deeper, grows with more pernicious root than summer seeming lost, and it hath been the sword of our slain kings. Yet do not fear, Scotland hath foisons to fill up your will, of your mere own. All these are portable, with other graces weighed.
I have none. The king becoming graces as justice, verity, temperance, stableness, bounty, perseverance, mercy, lowliness, devotion, patience, courage, fortitude, I have no relish of them, but abound in the division of each several crime, acting it many ways. Nay, had I power, I should pour the sweet milk of concord into hell, uproar the universal peace, confound all unity on earth. Oh, Scotland, Scotland!
If such a one be fit to govern, speak. I am as I have spoken.
Fit to govern? No, not to live. O nation miserable, with an untitled tyrant bloody sceptred, when shalt thou see thy wholesome days again? Since that the truest issue of thy throne, by his own interdiction, stands accursed, and does blaspheme his breed. Thy royal father was a most sainted king. The queen that bore thee, often upon her knees, then on her feet, died every day she lived. Fare thee well. These evils thou repeatest upon thyself have banished me from Scotland. O my breast, thy hope ends here.
Macduff, this noble passion, child of integrity, hath from my soul wiped the black scruples, reconciled my thoughts to thy good truth and honour. Devilish Macbeth by many of these traits has sought to win me into his power, and modest wisdom plucks me from over-credulous haste. But God above deal between thee and me, for even now I put myself to thy direction, and unspeak mine own detractions, here abjure the taints and blames I laid upon myself. For strangers to my nature, I am yet unknown to women, never was forsworn, scarcely have coveted what was mine own, at no time broke my faith, would not betray the devil to his fellow, and delight no less in truth than life. My first false speaking was this upon myself, what I am truly, is thine and my poor country's to command. Whither indeed, before thy here approach, old Seward, with 10,000 warlike men, already at a point, was setting forth, now wheeled together, and the chance of goodness be like our warranted quarrel. Why are you silent? Such welcome and unwelcome things at once, 'tis hard to reconcile.
Enter a doctor. Well, more anon. Comes the king forth, I pray you?
Ay, sir, There are a crew of wretched souls that stay his cure. Their melody convinces the great essay of art, but at his touch, such sanctity hath heaven given his hand, they presently amend. I thank you, doctor. What's the disease he means? 'Tis called the evil, a most miraculous work in this good king, which often since my here remain in England I have seen him do. How he solicits heaven himself best knows. But strangely visited people, all swollen and ulcerous, pitiful to the eye, the mere despair of surgery, he cures, hanging a golden stamp about their necks, put on with holy prayers, and, 'tis spoken, to the unsucceeding royalty he leaves the healing benediction. With this strange virtue he hath a heavenly gift of prophecy, and sundry blessings hang about his throne that speak him full of grace. Enter Ross. See, who comes here? My countryman, but yet I know him not. I am a gentle cousin, welcome hither. Alas, poor country, most afraid to know itself, it cannot be called our mother, but our grave, where nothing but who knows nothing is once seen to smile, where sighs and groans and shrieks that rend the air are made, not marked, where violent sorrows seem a modern ecstasy, the dead man's knell. Is there scarce asked for who, and good men's lives expired before the flowers in their caps, dying or ere they sicken. O relation, too nice and yet too true, what's the newest grief? That of an hour's age doth hiss the speaker. Each minute teems a new one. How does my wife? Why, well. And all my children? Well too. The tyrant has not battered at their peace? No, they were well at peace when I did leave 'em. Be not a niggard of your speech. How goes it? I came hither to transport the tidings, which I have heavily borne. There ran a rumour of many worthy fellows that were out, which was to my belief witness the rather for what I saw the tyrant's power afoot. Now is the time of help. Your eye in Scotland would create soldiers, make our women fight, to doff the dire distresses. Be it their comfort, we are coming thither. Gracious England hath lent us good seaward, and 10,000 men, an older and a better soldier none, that Christendom gives out. But I could answer this comfort with the like, but I have words that would be howled out in the desert air, where hearing should not latch them. What concern they? The general cause, or is it a fee grief, due to some single breast? A mind that's honest, but in it shares some woe, though the main part pertains to you alone. If it be mine, keep it not from me. Quickly, let me have it. Let not your ears despise my tongue forever, which shall possess them with the heaviest sound that ever yet they heard. I guess at it. Your castle is surprised, your wife and babes savagely slaughtered, to relate the matter where, on the quarry of these murdered deer, to add the death of you. Merciful heaven, what man? Ne'er pull your hat upon your brows, give sorrow words. The grief that does not speak whispers the o'erfought heart and bids it break. My children too? Wife, children, servants, all that could be found. And I must be from thence. My wife killed too? I have said. Be comforted. Let us make medicines of our great revenge to cure this deadly grief. He has no children. All my pretty ones. Did you say all? Oh, hellkite, all? What? All my pretty chickens and their dam in one fell swoop. Dispute it like a man. I shall do so, but I must also feel it as a man. I cannot but remember such things were that were most precious to me. Did heaven look on, and would not take their part? Sinful Macduff, they were all struck for thee. Naught that I am, not for their own demerits, but for mine. Fell slaughter on their souls. Heaven rest them now. Is the whetstone of your sword? Let grief convert to anger. Blunt not the heart, enrage it. I could play the woman with mine eyes, and brag it with my tongue. But gentle heavens, cut short all intermission, front to front. Bring thou this fiend of Scotland and myself within my sword's length, set him. If he scape, heaven forgive him too. Tune goes manly. Come, go we to the king, our power is ready. Our lack is nothing but our leave. Macbeth is ripe for shaking, and the powers above put on their instruments. Receive what cheer you may, the night is long that never finds the day. Okay, so I believe that is the longest scene in the play, and I'm just going to quickly run through the language and some of the ideas that come through in this scene. So returning to page 156, we're going to start by looking at line 3 where Macduff is speaking. And he says the phrase mortal sword. And mortal here is meaning deadly, so it causes mortality. It is a mortal sword. Underneath that, on line 4, he says, bestride our downfall and birthdom. So bestride here means to defend. So it means defend our fallen homeland. And lastly, at the end of Macduff's speech, on line 9, he talks about like syllable of dollar. He says Scotland yelled out like syllable of dollar. And that means there were similar cries. So Scotland was crying out similarly to the way its citizens were crying out. We'll go underneath that to where Malcolm starts to speak. On line 16, he says to offer up a weak, poor, innocent lamb to appease an angry God. And that is talking about a sacrifice, the idea that they are sacrificing Malcolm to Macbeth. And then as we continue down, we see the line on line 23, angels are bright still, though the brightest fell. And it's talking there, the brightest, about Lucifer. It's this old Jewish mythology. The idea, I'll read out the modern English translation. My fears can't actually make you evil. Angels are still bright, even though Lucifer, the brightest angel, fell from heaven. So it's all of these biblical and old Jewish mythological references. And that would have been to appease or compliment King James, who was incredibly religious and who commissioned the King James Bible, as mentioned before. On page 158 now, Malcolm says, perchance even there where I did find my doubts. And what he means there is, perhaps your actions have made me doubt you. So this is the first clue we get that Malcolm will be testing Macduff, that what he's going to say isn't true, he's just testing Macduff's loyalty. And he does backtrack on this and he says, I pray you, let not my jealousies be your dishonours. So he's saying, let not my suspicions dishonour you. And then Macduff cries out for the country. He says, bleed, bleed, poor country. And he says the phrase, great tyranny, lay thou thy basest shore. So great tyranny, he's referring to Macbeth. And when he says, lay thou thy basest shore, he says, establish yourself. The title is a feared means, so this is a line down again. You're right, the crown is legally confirmed. So he's saying that the title is for Malcolm, not for Macbeth. And if we go down to the bottom of this page, slide 49, whilst Malcolm is speaking, he says, more suffer and more sundry ways than ever. So he's saying suffer more in more ways. So they're just decrying the suffering that's occurring in Scotland in this page. On the next page, so 160, Malcolm talks about confineless harms. He's talking about infinite evils. Remember to always read the modern English translation if you're confused over any parts. So if I was just to read out that in English, he's saying, Scotland will call him a sweet lamb when they compare him to me and my infinite evils. So this is where Malcolm starts to trick Macduff. And Macduff is trying to ignore this. He's saying, not in legions. He's saying, in no way could you be worse than Macbeth. And then, as I mentioned in class, I've written on my page there, begins to test Macduff's loyalty. So that's a marker for me to understand that this is where Malcolm begins to trick Macduff.
And he's saying, firstly, this whole first paragraph, he's saying that he's full of lust, and that his lust is endless, and that could lead him to be a bad king. When he's talking about a cistern, that is in reference to a foul vessel or a container. So he's likening himself to this foul vessel of death, and that's how he sees himself. And then we're looking at Macduff's reply now. Down below line 70, he says, "You may convey your pleasures in a spacious plenty and yet seem cold." So this is basically saying you can deceive the public by seeming cold, which means not lusty at all. So you are cold-blooded, not hot-blooded. So in this case, that means virtuous, by seeming virtuous. And he's saying we can get you to satisfy your desires in secret. We'll turn to page 162 when Malcolm goes even further and says, well, there's more to that. So when he says, with this there grows, he's saying along with that, is his ill-composed affection, so his unbalanced nature, that means, of staunchless avarice. So staunchless, if you think about if you're bleeding, if you were to staunch the flow of blood, that means to stop the flow of blood. So it's unable to be stopped. And avarice means greed, so unstoppable greed. Were I king, I should cut off. Now, cut off doesn't mean what we think it means today. If you were to cut someone off financially, that just means that you cut off their supply of money. In the past, so if you were to cut someone off, that means to literally kill them, to literally cut them off the land. So when he's saying I should cut off the nobles for their land, he's saying that I will kill the nobles and take their lands because of his greed. And we'll go down to Macduff's response now, under line 85. He's saying that this avarice sticks deeper. So he's saying this greed is worse than your lust. So it'll cause more problems than the lust does. And Macduff's response, and he says, Scotland hath foisons. So foisons here means an abundance. So Scotland has an abundance to fill up your will of your mere own, and mere own is royal property belonging to you. So he's basically saying Scotland's a wealthy country, and if you become king, you'll surely get enough that your greed won't overtake you. And then he says, but I'm sure you have good qualities that outweigh this bad side. And Malcolm's response on line 93 is, I have none. So he says, I have no good qualities. I have no qualities that would make me a good king. And we can see Macduff is honest in his response. He doesn't go, yeah, but become a king anyway, and then I'll be a right-hand man and I'll get all I want. He goes, oh, Scotland, Scotland. So he's terrified of this idea that there is no one to take the throne. And Malcolm asks if there's anyone else, tell me, who can govern. And Macduff tells Malcolm he's not fit to live. This is on page 164 now. And he goes on and on about how miserable Scotland is because there will never be a good king. And he says the truest issue of the throne, so he's referring to Malcolm there, saying he's the most legitimate heir. And he also uses the phrase, and then he goes on to talk about how great Duncan was as a king, and then he mentions the late Queen, Duncan's wife. And he says a few things about the Queen. He said that bore thee oftener upon her knees than on her feet. So it's saying she was on her knees in prayer more than she was on her feet walking around. And it says that she died every day she lived, and that is to say, she lived every day like it was her last. She lived every day like she was already dead and had gone to heaven. So she was a very spiritual woman, virtuous. She might have been based on the medieval queen, Queen Margaret in Scotland, who was also very virtuous and had a chapel built for her as well in Edinburgh Castle. If we continue going down, we can look at line 120. Malcolm says, by many of these trains, so this is where Malcolm starts to reveal that he was just tricking, that he isn't any of these things, he's actually quite a good bloke. So he's talking about devilish Macbeth, and he says, but by many of these trains is referring to plots, hath sought to win me into his power. So what is revealed here is that Macbeth has been sending agents over to England to try to trick Malcolm, to get Malcolm to bow to Macbeth and see him as the legitimate king. And Malcolm says that this wisdom plucks me from over-credulous haste. So over-credulous haste is referring to trusting and believing too easily, just like Duncan did. That was Duncan's downfall. So Malcolm has learned from his father's mistake, and he has decided to be less trustworthy and to test people. And he says, unspeak mine own detraction. So unspeak basically means to forget here. My own detraction is to forget the words I said against myself. So detraction, like the crimes I brought against myself, kind of thing. And here, abjure means retract. So basically, this whole line is him saying, forget what I just said, take it all back, forget, like turn it around in your mind. And taints and blames I laid upon myself, for strangers to my nature. And he goes through, he says first, I am yet unknown to women. So this means that Malcolm is still a virgin, he is not yet known women, and that's also good because he's meant to be a Christian king, and so he's also followed the rules of the Bible because he hasn't slept with anyone else outside of marriage. And then he says, never was forsworn, scarcely has coveted. So coveted means to desire or hunger over anything. So he's again going to the opposite of what he said he was before. So before he said he had unending lust, and now he's saying he's a virgin and has no, it is implied he has no desire to sleep with women outside of marriage. And then he says that he hasn't even desired anything that was not even that was his own. He didn't even desire what he already had, let alone wanting to cut everybody else off from their lands. And again, that's a biblical concept which would be appealing to King James as a Christian, Scottish, and English king. And we'll keep going over to page 165. And he goes on and on about how he's actually the opposite of what he said he was when he was tricking Macduff. And Macduff, like the audience probably is confused. He just says, 'tis hard to reconcile, so it's hard to make sense of all these different stories. And that's when the doctor comes in, and this is another interesting thing to note. Another biblical reference, and as you can see, Macbeth, out of all of Shakespeare's plays, had the most biblical and Christian references of all his works, because of its audience, which was King James. And the doctor says, they ask if the king comes forth, and the doctor says, yes, I, sir. So I remember that means yes in this older English, this early modern English. And he says, there are a crew of wretched souls that stay his cure. So this is in reference to a Christ-like healing that Queen Elizabeth claimed she had. And she said that she had inherited it from her ancestor, Edward the Confessor, who was also King James's ancestor. And the idea was that they could touch people who were ill and that they would be cured. And we can see this further down. Macduff asks what the disease is that they're curing, and Malcolm says, "'Tis called the evil." And they talk about Edward's miraculous healing touch, which is brought down from heaven. So they use the power of heaven to heal people who are swollen, ulcerous, and have painful eye conditions. Oh, no, they look pitiful to the eye. Sorry, I read that as they have pitiful eyes. No, they look pitiful to the eye. And when it says the mere despair, that's meaning utter despair, not a little bit of despair, utter despair. And what he does is he hangs a golden stamp, and this golden stamp, this is line 155, is in reference to a gold coin with the figure of Saint Michael stamped on it. And he hangs that around their neck. And we're turning now to page 168, and we'll go down to line 164, and Malcolm says, I know him now, good God, but time's removed. So this is referring to Ross enters in. Malcolm doesn't recognize him at first, and Macduff says, it's my cousin, and then Malcolm says, but time's removed, which means quickly remove. That means that make us strangers. So get him over here, I'll give him a hug. I don't know if you'd actually hug him, but he's getting rid of anything that's making them strangers. And then Ross begins to talk. He says, alas, poor country. So he's basically prefacing that he comes with bad news. And he talks about where nothing, but our grave where nothing. And that's saying when no one is born. So basically, we don't know whether he's just being overdramatic, but if we look at what he's saying, that Scotland's no longer recognisable. It's a land where everyone will die and no one will smile. Everyone sighs and shrieks and no one notices, where violent sorrow is common emotion and where the funeral bells ring. So apparently a lot of people are dying, and it's not known whether this is in reference to just Macduff's family along with Banquo and Duncan, so all the nobles are dying, or if there has been more deaths that aren't mentioned in the play. But that is the news Ross brings. And on page 170, we see our next bit of tricky language in this section of the play. And it comes through Ross avoiding telling Macduff that his family's dead. And he keeps saying that they are well. And well is an old Elizabethan term that meant at peace. And it could be used to describe the well, like the alive. So if you were at peace but alive, you could be described as well. I am well, I'm peaceful. But it also would be described as someone who is dead. You would say, she is well, she is at peace. And so there's a double meaning here. This is why he's not lying technically when he says they are well. He is saying that they are dead, but he's carefully choosing the word so that Macduff doesn't get it right away. And Macduff keeps pushing him. He says, be not a niggard, and this just means stingy. And as we go down to line 185, Ross says, worthy fellows that were out. So were out means in open rebellion against Macbeth. So he brings tidings first before he gives the true details about Macduff's family, that there are people in Scotland who have armed themselves against Macbeth. And he says, which was to my belief witness, so which confirmed what he already thought, which is that that Macbeth's army is on the move, so also Macbeth is getting ready to fight back. And I'll go to page 172 now. Malcolm says, that's okay, we'll come too. Like, I'll bring my new army from England, and we'll come and fight him. And Ross says, I wish I could repay the happiness with good news, so would I could answer this comfort with the like. And then he does say that there are sad words he has to give. When hearing them, should not latch them. And latch there means catch. And Macduff automatically knows it's for him. He says, of what concern are they? He talks about fee grief, which is private sorrows. And Ross keeps putting it off. He says that the bad news is for Macduff alone, and Macduff demands he tells him, and that is when Ross, again, he's still putting it off, says, you don't want to hear it, don't be angry at me when I tell you, and then he finally does. He tells him that your castle is surprised, your wife and babes savagely slaughtered, to relate the manner where on the quarry of these murdered deer to add the death of you. And he's referring to, on the quarry of is in reference to a pile of bodies, and he's basically saying they would have added you to the pile of bodies had you been there, so they come to kill Macduff. And Malcolm cries out, merciful heaven, what man? So he's there. What man means don't cover your face. It's an old phrase. So he says, don't keep your face hidden. So he automatically starts to tell Macduff not to grieve in a sorrowful way, because he wants Macduff to use his sorrow and turn it into revenge so he can come and fight for him. On page 174, we see the words fell slaughter, on line 233, which means cruel slaughter. And then further down at line 138, Macduff says cut short all intermission, so that means don't delay. And then on the last page, Malcolm talks about there's nothing but our leave, all that is left to say is goodly. And then they also say on line 245, put on their instruments, which means arm themselves. So they're about to go into the final act where the war breaks out and Macbeth is killed. So a brief touch on a major theme that is seen here that isn't seen in many other scenes, and that is the theme of masculinity. We discussed this briefly in class, and you will remember we see a different kind of masculinity from previously in the play, and that is shown through Macduff. So we see two extremes earlier on in Macbeth. Macbeth starts out in a weird dual state, where on the one hand he is described as incredibly savage in battle, that he carves through the enemy soldiers with steam coming from his sword, that he cut a man from his navel to his jaw while he's in battle. So there's this very violent side of his masculinity. But we also see a softer, loving side toward Duncan. And we also see him be very meek toward his wife, Lady Macbeth. And so these two sides to him end up leading to his demise, because his weaker side makes him mentally weak and be pushed around, and his stronger side is actually violent and savage. And Macduff has these two sides, but they're the complete opposite. So when it comes to his gentler side, he is not weak. He loves his children and he loves his wife, and he's not afraid to show it. When Malcolm questions him and says, be a man, don't cry over this, he's like, oh, he doesn't have children, these are my chickens, these are my babies, and he's not afraid to cry. But on the other hand, when he's called to battle, when he's called to seek revenge and avenge his family, he is also able to have that strength. But the difference to Macbeth is his weaker side, or his softer side, because it's not a weakness, and his stronger side is run by himself and his own ideals and beliefs. It's not run or pushed around by anyone else. Whereas Macbeth, who also has these two different sides, he is being pushed around by Lady Macbeth. He doesn't make up his own mind, and when he has to keep going to the witches as well, and they push him around and they push him to do certain things. He can't seem to make his own mind or do his own thing, and that leads him to have a very destructive type of masculinity, whilst you could argue that Macbeth is more constructive and he gets done what he needs to get done, and he is able to fight for the greater good. Another example of masculinity you could bring in here is that of Duncan, who was very kind, but it was almost down to his downfall. He was very strong, he was a good leader, but he trusted too much. And you could compare that to his son, who possesses all those qualities, but he has the added benefit of being clever and not as trusting. And you could compare all four of those men as different expressions of the masculinity at this point at the end of Act 4.